Hi, everybody. Good to an Erev Rosh HaShana. Tonight, um, we are holding on a Tuesday night. Typically, we give our tefillah shiur on a Wednesday night. However, tomorrow night is Rosh HaShana. And I wanted to do what the kids call drop a bonus episode. And essentially, I wanted to see if we can discuss Nisaneh Tokef in under 10 minutes, just because I thought it was interesting. I've been learning a lot about it, and there's so much to know, so much work that has been done on the Sana Tokef that it would be a shame to go by without giving a shear on it. Yet I can't imagine that anybody tomorrow is going to have the time to listen to a 1 hour diatribe on the history and historiography of Nisaneh Tokef. So I'm going to do my best to give a recap of Nisaneh Tokef, give the history in under 10 minutes, I hope, and have you walk away with some understanding of what this tefillah is and what this prayer is and why it's important to Jews around the world. So if you're coming here from anywhere on the internet, you could have been taken here by a book like Who by Fire, or you might have some interest in the songs around Nisaneh Tokef. However, let's just define what it is for anybody who doesn't know. Essentially, there's a set of prayers that Jews do on Rosh Hashanah. We call the whole worship of prayer, we call that liturgy. And in the Rosh Hashanah liturgy, there is a section called Musaf. In Musaf, the Shmona Esrei is repeated. The Amidah, the main part of the prayer, is repeated by the prayer leader, the Chazan. And in that section is a lot of poetic embellishment. If one is attending a synagogue or a shul where the prayer leader is Ashkenaz, I'm sorry, I should say the whole congregation is Ashkenaz, then the congregation will add a lot of poetic embellishment to this so-called repetition of the Amidah. Now, in that poetic embellishment is a so-called high point of the day for many of the worshipers in the synagogue. The high point in the worship and in the liturgy is technically, for many Jews who are praying, this hymn, this piece of liturgical poetry called Nesaneh Tokef. Now, the translation of the words, if you're going to paraphrase, is essentially, and let us voice the power of this day's sanctity. Essentially, what this poem says is, apologies, the what this poem essentially does is it begins with setting the stage for Rosh Hashanah and how serious of a day it is. It sets the stage for seating God on the throne as king, and how he's sitting on the seat of judgment. He's there with the book to judge all our deeds. And then the second section, it defines what's at stake. And this is the scary part. Who's going to live this year? Who's going to die? Who's going to have a year of abundance and plenty, and who will not? Thirdly, comes the part of hope, where it says that even if a person might have sinned that year and he might not be worthy of life, might not be worthy of success that year, a person can still do repentance and pray and do righteous deeds, and he can be redeemed. Finally, the poem ends with a reflection on how fragile human life is. It's a beautiful poem, and it has been a staple of the Ashkenazic prayer services in the Musaf prayer on Rosh Hashanah for probably 1,000 years. Now, many Jews consider this prayer so central, like so important to Rosh Hashanah, that it is their whole Rosh Hashanah. Nisaneh Tokef is Rosh Hashanah. Ironically, the Ashkenazi Jews didn't seem to have such a strong attitude towards Nisaneh Tokef before the 1950s. We don't have any evidence that the Jewish people considered Nisaneh Tokef to be a very important prayer before the 1950s. Furthermore, the Sephardic Jews who do say it because it is beautiful such as if you go to a Moroccan congregation, some Sephardic Jews who do say it will coast right through it. And I know in our congregation in the Tivot Yisrael, they typically do it on the second day of Rosh HaShana. They'll do nesaneh Tokef and they'll go through it. I mean, it's a serious poem and it's a beautiful poem, yet they don't make it the high point of the whole day. They don't open the Aron Kodesh with the dramatic Ashkenazi flair of opening the Aron Kodesh so that the whole congregation feels extra trepidation. There's none of that. So since it's been viewed as such an important prayer, at least since the 1950s and a little bit earlier, it's been popular earlier, but never so serious. There's been a tremendous amount of scholarship around this prayer, both because it's interesting and also because there are a lot of experts in the field of liturgy, experts in the field of hymnography, and honestly, we're a bunch of nerds, and not many people are specialists in A, rabbinics, B, in liturgy or hymnography. So the few people who do have enough expertise are very excited to start studying this because there's a lot there. There's a lot in legend, folklore, hymnography, liturgy, etc. So what exactly is the history as best as we know it here in 2024? The simple history is as follows. The poem itself is a type of poem from what we call us liturgy people. We call this the pre-classical era or the early classical era. All you have to know is that means that most likely from the style of this text, what it looks like is a poem that was written in roughly the 400s or the 500s. Furthermore, because of the style of the Hebrew and the style of the poetry, I mean, you might want to call it prose, but it's a prosaic poetry. From the style, it's almost definitely written in Byzantine Palestine. In other words, in Byzantine Eretz Yisrael in the 400s or 500s. That's the evidence we have from the content and the text. It is almost impossible to see it as being any later than the late 500s. That's the from the academic perspective, the latest you can put this prayer. I'll get nitty-gritty for just a second. There's something called a krova, which is a set of poems meant to supplant or replace the traditional Amidah. On Rosh HaShana, typically the krovot were specialized poems which created a more special Amidah for Rosh HaShana. In ancient Eretz Yisrael, I should say in the Dark Ages, in the 400s or 500s, the poets, so to speak, the liturgical poets, developed a special type of, what do you call it, kirova, or Amida poetry called a Kiddushta, which essentially ascends and ascends into the Kedusha, and it makes the Kedusha section of the Amida the high point. In that portfolio of poems is something called a siluk, which essentially is the last poem before the Kedusha itself begins. And in ancient Eretz Yisrael, there were multiple siluks for this section. One of them was nesaneh Tokef. One of the great Paitanim, Rabbi Elazar HaKalir, was clearly familiar with it. Rabbi Elazar HaKalir lived in the late 500s, early to mid 600s, and he was familiar with nesaneh Tokef, meaning that it's possible it was written by one of his earlier colleagues or contemporaries, such as Yanai. It seems very likely that it actually was written by Yanai, but there were other siluks. The French, for example, had a different siluk for the Kiddushta of Rosh HaShana, and that was what they used until eventually the Ashkenazi one, when nesaneh Tokef became the more popular version and was taken over. The best manuscript evidence we have from a historical perspective is that this was written in the 400s or 500s, possibly by a poet named Yanai. Simply the manuscript evidence seems to point in that direction, but we don't know for sure. The Hebrew, the language, everything points to the 5th or 6th century in Eretz Yisrael. Now, in popular Jewish folklore, there is a story about this poem, which catapulted it to extra fame, that the poem got extra famous. Essentially, the story goes like this. There is a sefer called Or Zarua, and in it he brings a story from another rabbi named Rabbi Ephraim Mibon. Rabbi Ephraim Mibon heard it from a rabbi who had a dream, And essentially, this is what happens. There was a rabbi named Amnon of Mainz, a person who probably never existed. However, he might have existed. The folktale goes like this, and I'll try to say it as quickly as possible because I'm sure many of the listeners know, and if you don't, you can look it up. Essentially, this folktale is like this. There's a rabbi who's approached by a bishop under oppression, and he tells him, please come. We need to make a final ultimatum. The rabbi has to convert to Christianity. The rabbi says, I have to think about it. Then he has remorse that he even said he had to think about it. And he goes back to the bishop at the end of the 3 days and he says, no, I want you to cut out my tongue and, do your worst, but I'm not converting to Christianity. And the bishop does his worst. And as the rabbi is about to die a few days later from his injuries, Rav Amnon of Mainz composes Nesaneh Tokef on his final day of Rosh HaShana, and he transmits it to a certain Rabbi Kalonimus Bar Kalonimus or Kalonimus Bar Meshulam, I don't remember, and tells him to tell Klal Yisrael to say the story. Now, if one reads the story himself, and if you're an expert in Yiddish folktales, you would understand that, as is the general rule with Jewish folktales, looking or at any folktale, seeing a legend or a folktale like this or hearing it tells you very little about actual history. A folktale tells you very little about what actually happened. In a typical folktale, you'll only hear about 10 to 20% of real history. But it tells you so much about the attitudes of the people who are telling the story, and the beliefs and the social structure and the realities and the fears and the anxieties and the hopes of the people who are saying these stories. Now, dying al Kiddush Hashem, or martyrdom, was a tremendously big deal for people who lived in Western Europe under Christian kingdoms. The Jews who lived under those Christian kingdoms were constantly under the fear of the religion of Christianity, and especially of the bishops, and especially of the kings and all their Christian neighbors who were constantly scaring them to death. Obviously, we know the Crusades were a tremendous trauma for the Jews who suffered many persecutions. So for the Jewish people, suffering and giving one's life for the name of God in martyrdom was an incredibly important idea, that a person should rather give up his life than convert to Christianity. So, because this piyut, this poem, speaks about who shall live and who shall die, and it's associated with this folktale, many people took this folktale as fact. However, we know from the Karaganese, of course, that this poem predates this story of the so-called Amnon of Mainz. And we know it's at least from probably the 9th century, 8th century. We have very old manuscripts of it. But what does it tell us? It tells us, the story does tell us, that people venerated people who would die al Kiddush Hashem. It tells us that Nesaneh Tokef was a special prayer to people, that they did see it as a special prayer. It tells us that they associated it with people called Kalonimus, and they associated it with somebody named Amnon. Kalonimus and Amnon were two very popular family names from the Jewish rabbi families that came in from Italy. Now, it is very normal and natural that the Italian rabbis who came in from Italy and first came to Germany were bringing those traditions with them, since they carried over that school of the poetic school of Eretz Yisrael. And so it would be very attractive to the idea, to hear the idea that some of this has history, that the rabbis who transmitted this poem were the ones who received the school of poetry from Eretz Yisrael. That, in a nutshell, is the actual history of Nesaneh Tokef. We don't actually know who wrote it. We do know that it's beautiful. And we know that it received more attention and more popularity because of a folktale that was recorded in the 13th century in Germany. Now, as far as modern day, I did mention it became much more popular after the 1950s, and we find rabbis speaking about Nesaneh Tokef with much more fervor after that point. And that is obviously because of the Holocaust. After the Holocaust, the trauma of the Jewish people, it was so tremendous that the Nesaneh Tokef became more than a high point, but a central point of Rosh HaShana, since these ideas of life and death were so incredibly, what should I say? These ideas of life and death and suffering and plague were so incredibly pertinent and so incredibly in front of people's eyes and part of their lived experience that making the nesaneh Tokef prayer a central prayer in Rosh Hashanah and a more heartfelt prayer was what led most people to tears and what made people's Rosh Hashanah. And if the way I think about it, just to end off, uh, is that first of all, if you would ask any rabbi, what is Rosh Hashanah about? Most educated rabbanim will hesitate or not hesitate, but they'll usually answer Malchi V'Shayfres. Right? The three main points of Rosh Hashanah is coronating God, accepting His sovereignty, remembering that God is calling upon our actions and judging the way we behave that year, and finally the mitzvah of shofar. So Malchus, Sechonos, V'Shofros are the theology of Rosh Hashanah. Yet those are very abstract things, coronating God, a heavenly judgment, and some mitzvah that we don't really understand. These are very abstract things. However, nesaneh Tokef has the ability to make all the abstract theology of Rosh Hashanah very, very real and to speak it out in a way that has imagery that really speaks to people. And from all the piyutim that people say on Rosh Hashanah, it is one of the easiest to understand because the style is so simple and so pre-classical or early classical. For example, it's the siluk of a piyut from Kalir called Upad Me'az L'Shefet Hayom. Most people can't even translate half of that. But nesaneh Tokef has a much simpler language, and it makes the concepts of Rosh Hashanah that are much more approachable, much more understandable, much more attainable, and relatable, I should say, to the congregants. So I feel my personal opinion is that the reason nesaneh Tokef became such a popular piyut is not just because of the folktale. It's also because of its ease of readability and because of the relatability that it brought to the ideas of Rosh Hashanah, to ideas of tshuva, tefillah, and tzedakah. Now, if anybody wants to do further research, because again, this is only, I think maybe we're at 15, maybe 20 minutes. I'm sorry. I did my best. I would start for the history. Lawrence Hoffman made a book, Who by Fire, Who by Water. That's a really nice book. It has 2 chapters on the history in the beginning. And also there's an article in the Jewish Synagogue Music. It's page 166 in the Journal of Synagogue Music from fall, volume 38, fall 2013. On page 166, John Planier did a very good summary of what we know about nesaneh Tokef right now, and it's a very good springboard for anybody looking to do further research. So I appreciate your time. Ketiva v'chatima tova. I hope everybody has a very meaningful Rosh Hashanah. If you have any questions, please send me on Spotify or email me. And Bezrat Hashem in the future, we will talk more about nesaneh Tokef.